Well, now let's jump into the word that was given to us way back when. And just to review, we've been looking at the question or the issue as disciples of Jesus. How do we address our minds? The thoughts that come into our minds that we aren't wanting to be there, but there they are. Ways of thinking that aren't like Jesus, but that's how we think, so what do we do about that? So we've been looking at a lot of scriptures and some practical things we can do in the process of training our minds to be changed. So we're just going to look at several more texts that give us some of these perspectives, and some of them are actual practical things we can do. But I wanted to start in Ephesians chapter 4. You okay?
Thank you.
Ephesians 4, 17 through 24. Now what we're going to see here is Paul giving us a contrast between the way you used to think, or the Ephesians, the way the Ephesians used to think and the way that they're now being called to think, or the way their minds are supposed to be now that they're in Christ. So this is a really good place to go because this is the issue, this is the question. How do we go from one place to the next in our minds and our thinking? So again, we're in Ephesians 4, 17 through 24. And once you're ready, if anyone's willing, if you'd read that for us.
So I tell you this, and insist on it in the Lord, that you must no longer live as the Gentiles do, in the futility of their thinking. They are darkened in their understanding and separated from the life of God, because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardening of their hearts. Having lost all sensitivity, they have given themselves over to sensuality, so as to indulge in every kind of impurity with a continual lust for more. You, however, did not come to know Christ that way. Surely you heard of him and were taught in him in accordance with the truth that is in Jesus. You were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires, to be made new in the attitude of your minds, and to put on the new self created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness.
Thank you. Now that is a dense little section of writing right there. There's a lot to unpack. But what I wanted to observe first of all is how he describes the former way of thinking, or the former state of mind, for particularly the Gentile people. Now the Jewish people had... the observant Jewish people had another way of thinking that needed to change, but that's not what he's addressing here. But notice the language he uses to describe the way their thinking used to be. You must no longer live as the Gentiles do, active living. But their living came out of a way of thinking, and at least in the NIV, what's the word that he uses there to describe their thinking?
Futility.
Futility. Interesting. Any other translation have a different word? And the futility of their thinking? Okay, everybody's got that one? So what does futile mean?
Life, well, here's my footnote. Futility of their thinking. Life without God is intellectually frustrating, useless, and meaningless.
Mm-hmm. Futile has to do with without meaning, without purpose. Resistance is futile. The thinking of the Gentile mind, meaning godless, is futile. It's interesting, especially the way that footnote puts it. It's intellectually frustrating to live without God, which it almost seems like a bit of a bold statement because a lot of intellectual people deny God's existence or relevance. So how can so many really intellectual people live an intellectual lifestyle if they're denying God, if it's true that denying God is intellectually frustrating? Well, I'm recently reading a book by C.S. Lewis called Pilgrim's Regress. which is similar to Pilgrim's Progress, but it's an allegory just like that. But his intention is more an intellectual allegory than Bunyan's. Bunyan's was the spiritual journey you take, and he calls Pilgrim the Pilgrim Christian and all that. Well, in Lewis's book, he kind of follows the same track as Bunyan did, but it's more about the intellectualist's journey through all the intellectual modes of thinking in the world, and that finally finds Jesus, right? So it's kind of, a lot of it's over my head because I don't know who a lot of these people are he's referencing. But it's really good. But this verse reminds me very much of that. Because as he unpacks the different ways of thinking in the world, like the classicists and the communist view of things and, all the different thinkings, he shows their futility. He shows how they defeat themselves if you take their logic to the furthest extent. And all the ways of thinking that deny God or make him out to be myth or this dangerous opiate for the masses or whatever like that. And his intellect is hard to parallel because C.S. Lewis was brilliant. But in his view of thinking, once he found Christ, he realized the futility of all the other thoughts he had explored. And he said, this wasn't meant to be autobiographical, but it is the process he went through. Because if you're intellectual, and I've actually talked to some folks in our church where their spouse is this way or their friend is this way. If you're intellectual, whatever that means, if you consider yourself intellectual, you almost feel silly believing in God sometimes. Because he's not like this table. He's not like this, I can't put him in a test tube or find fragments of him in the dirt somewhere to study. And if Paul's right, then the person who lives in that physical realm only is actually the one who's living in futility. And even people who are spiritual without the truth of God are living in futility. Now, this is a pretty stark picture for a person if their entire way of thinking and viewing the world is meaningless and pointless. And then it says in verse 18, those people are darkened in their understanding. Which I think you could say is akin to being blind, right? I mean, darkness leads to not seeing, which you could call blind. So they're darkened in their understanding. They don't understand clearly reality. They're separated from the life of God because of ignorance, which also comes back to knowing in the mind. So a lot of what he's saying the problem is in the godless person it goes back to the mind, understanding, or lack of knowledge. Now, that of course is not in isolation, because notice at the end of verse 18, why is the mind so messed up? It says the ignorance that is in them due to what?
The hardening of their hearts.
The heart is at the root of it. And Jesus actually indicates that. He said the overflow of the heart is what the mouth speaks. It's where the evil desires come from. It's the wicked thoughts. The heart is really the root of everything else. So because someone's will is against God, they shut their minds off from actually being nourished with reality. Once your heart is turned away from the truth, your brain is cut off. It's starving for reality. And so the mind cut off from reality, from truth, it's going to do something. It's got to make sense of it. That's what the mind wants to do. It wants to make sense of information. And so you end up with, I think, what they put very well in your note there, which was frustration. Because I've got a lot of info to sort through, but I'm missing the biggest one that holds it all together, namely God and Christ. And so, it's very frustrating and futile. So, as much as Paul talks about the mind, what does he pin it all down to? Your heart is hardened against God. You won't submit. Now, why is all this instructive for us? Because if we want our minds to be renewed, and if that's a goal of ours is to have a mind like Christ, we just need to be clear that the heart of all of that starting and going forward is that our hearts are fully submitted to Christ. That we really, really want Him. that we know he's right, that we'll trust him when he talks, and we think he's really smart. We'll take his word for it. And so once our heart is given over to that, I'll tell you, the dam is broken and the river just flows, and your mind is washed in reality. Your mind will change. It's wonderful. Isn't that interesting that when John the Baptist and Jesus both came, and they told everyone the kingdom of God had come, what was the one thing they said that people had to do about it? What should they do because the kingdom of the heavens is here? Repent. That's it. Now, of course, that's a summary word, But why was repentance the core response that the people were to give? Because once they opened themselves up to the kingdom coming, that submission to the kingdom would allow their minds to change. It's that will problem that was the dam holding everything back. But once you submit, the torrent comes. And God will fill your mind with truth and reality as soon as that process starts. So, and then verse 19 is very interesting, because your heart is the problem, your thinking is messed up because of that. And then verse 17 and verse 19 tell us that all leads to how you live. Right? Do not live as the Gentiles do, is verse 17. Verse 19 is, they've given themselves over to sensuality, to indulge every kind of impurity. And they want more and more. In the New Updated NIV it says they're full of greed, which is the same thing as wanting more and more. So, interesting, in these couple of verses, Paul has pretty much described the domino effect in our inner being. Once your will is against God, your mind is cut off, you don't understand reality, so what are you left with? Well, whatever you can get. Whatever your body wants, that's all you know how to give it, right? But verse 20, it's like a breath of fresh air, because that's a pretty dark couple of verses there. That, however, is not the way you learned, the way of life you learned, when you heard about Christ and were taught in him in accordance with the truth that is in Jesus. So I was just observing the words he uses here. He says, learned, heard about, were taught. All of those things address the mind, right? Every one of those is about the way you think. You learn something new, Jesus and his way. You heard about him, that's how you learned it, and you were taught. Now, this is an interesting point. There's two parts of the process of our becoming to Jesus. One is the proclamation. The message is spoken. He's the Messiah, he's the Son of God, he died on the cross, he rose again. All those, the big news proclamation that everyone needs to know at the very beginning. But once you've believed the proclamation, you can't stop there. Because that's the point at which you probably get baptized. You've become a disciple. But you actually know very little. You know he's the king and that you need to follow him, which is awesome and essential, yay! But you just can't stop there. And so what he goes on to talk about is the things you were taught in him in accordance with his way. And that's where discipleship really kicks in. Now that you are a disciple, here, let's become like Jesus together. So the mind is going to go such a thorough renewal, but it begins at the proclamation of who Jesus is. That's the first real punch to the gut of your mind. Oh, something different's coming, If Jesus is who they're saying he is, this is going to change everything. It's almost like if your old Gentile mind, the one he just described, was a Jenga tower, the Jesus proclamation is that one piece that you take out to make the tower fall down. I mean, it's that one earthquake to your whole way of thinking that's like, oh, here it comes. This is going to change it all. And the flood's about to come. Now, once the tower of your old way of thinking falls down, Jesus has to come and rebuild with his blocks and make it the way it's supposed to be. And so I like the words he uses to describe this. You learned it, you heard about him, and you were taught in him according to his truth. And then verse 22, you were taught by the people who have taught you, because there are human people being used by Jesus in the process, but you were taught with regard to your former way of life, the one he just described, to put off your old self, which includes the mind, right? Because everything he just described, the mind was a big part of that. The old self, the old thinking is a big part of that, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires. And then look at verse 23, because this is the real heart of what I was wanting to look at with you. You were taught to be made new in the attitude of your minds. The language is interesting there, because he's telling them they were taught to do something, but that it's done to them. Do you notice that? You were taught to do something, but the language is to be made new. Isn't that an interesting way of doing it? So it's not like go change your clothes. Go change your clothes, you're being told to do something. You're doing it. This is, you were taught to be made new. So this is more like, go have your clothes changed for you. Wait, what? If someone else is doing it to me, what am I supposed to do? But you were taught to do it. Do what? Have your mind changed. What? So, talk through this with me. What does that mean? We're supposed to do something that's done to us. So what does it mean to you if you were taught to have your mind made new? What are you doing in that process if someone's making your mind new? What do you think? Did I communicate that clearly? Did I confuse everybody? Because the language he uses has two participants. You were taught to be made new. What does that mean? And I was trying to break it down to like the clothing being changed, because I can picture that clearly. So what would it look like?
It's more than that. It's more than changing clothes. It's from the inside out.
True. Well, I mean, just making sense of how I'm told to do something but have it done to me. So I was trying to think of what would a parallel be. So to me, the only thing I can think of is when you go to buy a suit, if you're a guy, you have to go to have your clothes hemmed or whatever. And so you're standing there, while they're chalking stuff up, and you're following their instructions, and you're putting your arms out, and they're doing this thing. So I had to make the choice to submit to the one doing it. That's ultimately what this is about, right? Like, I'm not getting my clothes, I'm not changing my clothes. They're doing that. But I had to do something in order for it to get done. I had to go and submit to them and raise my arms when they said that, lift my leg, whatever they told me to do. And so I totally agree with you. This is a much bigger process than changing clothes. But when he says you were taught to be made new, like, how else can I picture that? So what am I doing as my mind is being made new by somebody else?
You're getting an alteration.
Yeah, I'm submitting to him. I'm just, whatever he says to do in the process, okay, I'll do it. But I can't walk away and think, I changed my mind. No. He's doing it. But I had to be taught to be made new. I had to be taught to go and stand there and let him do his procedure and work it out. So the beauty of, I think, looking at that confusing way he words that is it helps us reflect on what grace really means. Because we in our churchy language can confuse a lot of really good words. And when we hear of grace and talk of grace, we usually talk of what we receive that we don't deserve. And that's very true. But a lot of people have taken that to an extreme which says, if I play any part at all in something, it's no longer grace. Because now I guess I've earned it somehow. That's why a lot of people talk of baptism as not being essential, because that means if it is, then I'm doing something to earn it or something. Wait, what? Remember, grace is generosity. That's a very good English word to replace grace, generosity. So generosity, grace, is as simple as getting a cup of water for someone who's coughing. Now, she didn't owe that to you, you didn't have a... Unless she whispered in your ear, you owe me one. But see, as soon as someone says you owe me one, it's no longer generosity. It's the worldly way of, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. The quid pro quo. But generosity is the heavenly kingdom way of saying, just because you needed it. Well, let me do something. No. But come on, And so the idea of generosity never precludes the involvement of the other person. So if I say, I want to take you out to lunch, be ready by 5. So you're ready by 5, I take you out to lunch, I bring you back, you don't say thank you. And maybe, I didn't do it so you say thank you, but maybe later I come back and say, it's kind of weird, you didn't seem to show any appreciation. Well, I was ready at 5, wasn't I? I did my part. What? You jerk, what are you talking about? So to think that because I did something, therefore I earned or deserve what you were going to give me is insane. Like none of us would think that in any real life situation. So to think that because God calls us to participate, it's less gracious of Him to change our mind because we entered into the process with Him and did something. It's no longer grace. It's crazy talk. I think actually, in my way of seeing it, it's more gracious. Just like it's more gracious for me to let Emma help me with a project, because it's going to take me longer. It's going to be more work for me. There's more generosity for me to say, come on and help me, than just stay out of this because I'll get it done faster and, better without you. Because it shows I care more about her than this work getting done or something. And so for Paul to say, you are taught to be made new is I think, the clearest way I can think of it is, you were taught to come under the yoke of Jesus and join Him in what He's doing to remake your thinking. What a beautiful picture that is. You were taught to partner with Him. He's doing the biggest part of this, and He's the only one who can do it, but you're going to Him and submitting to Him in the process. I think that's awesome. But the language, at least in the NIV, is be made new in the attitude of your minds. Is there anyone else have a different translation that puts it differently? To be new in the attitude of your minds. So this is more than information download. This is your posture, which I think comes back to the heart issue. What's your posture towards God? What's your posture towards the truth of Jesus? Now, actually, this is a really big issue in terms of our minds being made new, because we can set up our own dams when it goes back to the heart. We can cut off the flow of His washing of our minds. A really good example, probably the clearest one I can think of, is in Jesus' clear teachings about how to treat your enemy and forgiveness. I think the attitude of our mind, or the heart, as soon as we read what He says, we can have an intellectual frustration or a heart frustration that says, that's not reasonable. Or only super Christians can achieve that level of goodness, and that's not for me. I can't forgive everything and everybody, and I cannot love my enemies the way He's saying. As a hypothetical, I agree with him that that's the best way to go. But in terms of actually doing it, I'm not sure I can go there with him. That is an intellectual and a heart obstacle. And we cannot experience the overflow of our mind being transformed because, and here's the attitude part, I have decided my experience is to be trusted more than my master. Because He's standing here ready to offer me a new way of thinking. Repentance. He's offering me a chance to have an entirely different way to view life. And I've decided, I think I'll go on with my experience on this one. I can't forgive them. And Jesus is standing here going, yeah, you can. I'm telling you, you can. I'm right here. And we're like, nah. Take my word for this, Jesus. I can't. See, there's an attitude problem. That's not an information problem. It's an attitude problem. I'm trusting the wrong source. Now, that's going to be a roadblock all of us are going to have at some point in the learning process under Jesus. Our minds are going to be so stuck in the old experience-shaped way of thinking that we have this moment of crisis. I either trust what I've known to be true or Jesus. And some people, it's not those things. Maybe it's the issue of possessions. A lot of people really wrestle with what Jesus said about possessions. Now, He didn't say it to everybody, but He said to many people, sell everything you have, give it to the poor. And you'll have a purse in heaven that won't wear out. A lot of people are like, whoo, glad he didn't say that to me, because I don't know if I could do it if he did, you know. A lot of people, and I've wrestled with this too, because I grew up in the American culture where stuff is so easily had and it becomes such a big part of life. And I'm not the kind of guy that wants a lot of stuff, but the stuff I do have, I've had to wrestle with how big a hold does it have on my heart. Jesus comes along and actually teaches what he lived out every day, to hold everything loosely in this world. It's not that big a deal, you know. If you lose it all, you've got the kingdom, so you're fine. You know, what's the big deal? You don't know where your food's going to come from? Look at the bars, they're good. You know, he's so free from all of that. And we, in our American culture, where we're told constantly, and our experience tells us too, stuff will make you happy for a little while. For us to come to that crisis and think, okay, I've got what I've always known, and everyone seems to think this, and now Jesus is telling me something very different. Will I let him wash my mind, or will this be a roadblock to my new thinking? So those are just a couple of examples of way that I think what Paul's bringing up, the attitude of the mind is just as important as the info that's coming into it, because it's either going to be a red light or a green light for that to flow in here. And then let's just finish this thought. Put on the new self, including a new mind, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. We cannot become truly righteous and holy unless our minds are a part of that. Our minds play way too big a part for us to just, well, thank you for washing my spirit, Lord. I'll stick with what I've got going in the mind. It's like, nah. Your mind is such an integral part of you. And if your whole being is going to become like me, the mind's a part of that as well. So I'm telling you, this is meat to chew on. If you're not sure what to think about for the next week, that's a good passage to go back to. But let's move forward, because we've got a lot more to cover. 1 Corinthians 14:20. Now, as we're going there, any thoughts or responses to that passage? I'll give you a chance if you had some aha moments there. All right. Well, we're in 1 Corinthians 14:20. Before we jump into this, though, I did want to ask you, as I was talking about the obstacles we can have sometimes in our minds about things Jesus taught, do you know of any that you've had to encounter and deal with in your own process of your mind being changed? Have you ever hit any walls of teachings in the Scriptures and you just had a crisis? I'm not sure if I can go with him on this one. Now you're saying yes, Georgia? You're willing to share it?
When I was born, my mother wasn't married to my father. And he went out of my life whenever I was 3 years old. I hated Father's Day. I hated anything that had to do with fathers. When I got into my teens, I didn't hate my father, but I disliked him intensely. I graduated. I sent him a graduation announcement. And he didn't come. So I told the minister, which was, I think, Elmer Fritz then, how I felt. And he said, "How do you feel about that?" And I said, "I don't like feeling I hate someone." And he said, "Take it to the Lord and pray about it for a week." So I did that. And he gave me some scriptures to look at it. And finally, I just came to the conclusion that my father missed out on the best thing in his life, me. And if that's God's will, then that's God's will. And my mother died, and I turned 20. 18 months later, he died. He got crushed by, he was dumping coal into a coal car, and he got drafted in.
Wow.
And I felt, well, that's God's will, that he wasn't going to be a part of my life. Maybe God said, it's time for you to come home. And I just always felt God took care of it. But somebody said, do you love your dad? Why do you hate your dad? I said, I don't love him, but I feel sorry for him because he missed out on me.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a big crisis in my life from the time I was born until I was 19.
Yeah. That's what I mean. In theory, we know Jesus is right.
Yeah.
And then you have an experience that makes you think, wait, but is it possible? Is that real? You know? It's easy to throw words around and say, oh, this is how things should be. Yeah, sure. You know? This is how marriage should look like. Okay. But we've real people in the mix, so what now? So yeah, to have the willingness to just say, all right, Jesus, you understand better than I do. You must be right. Thank you for sharing that. Anyone else? Anyone else hit that wall before on any issue? All right. Well, maybe think on that. Think on that as you kind of go through your days with Jesus. Are there any issues I've had trouble taking his word for it? Just going with him on this one, even if I don't fully understand it. Well, let's look at what Paul had to say to the Corinthians here in 1 Corinthians 14:20. And if someone would read that verse, it's a standalone verse, but we'll look at the context. But the statement itself, I think, can be applied pretty generally. So, let somebody read that.
Brothers and sisters, stop thinking like children. In regard to evil, be infants, but in your thinking, be adults.
Dang. Thanks, Apostle. Woo. So, the context here, I don't know if you're familiar with the problem going on in the Corinthian church at the time, but they were using their gifts of the Holy Spirit, like speaking in tongues, prophecy, and the healing and all the rest. The kind of the supernatural ones that were very obvious to people. And so there are gifts of the Spirit like leadership and service that may not seem as, wow, spiritual. They're still gifts of the Spirit. But these are the gifts that were very demonstrative, that people could tell something supernatural was going on. And their problem was they were using the gifts. God gave it to them, and apparently they were allowed to use it the wrong way. It's not like God yanked it away as soon as they misused it. They were using it to build themselves up personally, to make themselves more important than their brothers and sisters, to be more prestigious in the community. And Paul's whole point, as he talks about this, is, first of all, hold on. The point of the gifts is to build the body, not to make you look good. And number two, emphasize the gifts that help everybody. So that's why, for instance, he says, if you're speaking in tongues and there's no one there to interpret, so other people can benefit from it, just keep it to yourself. Wait till you get home. But if you're prophesying, bringing a word from God to the people, do it, because everyone's going to benefit from that. So that's kind of his general point here. All the gifts are good, all the gifts are needed, but use the ones in the gathering that help the gathering, not that just help individuals. And so that's his whole theme when he says what he says in verse 20. Brothers and sisters, stop thinking like children. Now, based on what I've described, do you see why he would say they're thinking like children? Because here's the question that we've got to wrestle with when we read this verse. What is the difference? What are the distinguishing marks between childish thinking and adult thinking? How would you describe that? What's the difference between childish and mature thinking? How can you tell the difference?
When you're children, it's all about me.
Aha. Yep. And they don't really have to learn that from anyone. I'm the center of my own little world because I'm behind these eyes and between these ears. And, I feel what I feel. That's right. What else? What else would you think defines childish thinking versus mature thinking? We could say adult thinking, but not all adults are really mature. So let's say mature. In fact, just as a side note, but one of the dangerous trends we're seeing, and it's going a lot with our young adult population, up into my generation, it's almost seen as a badge of honor to remain immature. To play video games when you're not at work, you just act like you're a teenager, but you've got money to spend, so you get the cooler toys now, you know? And that's a real thing going on in my generation particularly. There are people around my age, and I don't spend time with them anymore because they're back in California, but I see their Facebook, and everything is about sports, superheroes, video games. These are like grown adults with kids. Not to say that hobbies are bad, but I'm like, what? You know? So that's why adult doesn't necessarily mean mature. But what's that?
They grow up with all these
That's right.
toys.
That's right.
Problem.
And now I can afford them because I've got a job. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a habit and they can't break it.
Yeah.
But they also feel entitled.
And adults are getting into it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
Because they can't get away from kids.
So, again, let's just use the word mature, and just to clarify, what are other distinguishing marks between childish thinking and mature thinking, would you say? The selfish thing is a big one. What else?
I think of innocence in children.
Okay. Now, interesting, he said, in regard to evil, like on the moral level, be infants. With there's a sense of naivete, you know, like, in terms of what's good and evil, I want what's good. I don't have an interest in dabbling in the evil stuff. But he distinguishes the moral element from the intellectual element. In thinking now, be adults. So how would that translate in terms of thinking, do you think? The childish innocence, how would that transfer into thinking compared to a mature adult? Yeah, I don't know. That one, a mature adult could still be
Naive.
Yeah.
I'm still naive at 62 about things.
There's a good naivete. I think that's what he means by, in reference to evil, be infants. Like, I have faced this danger myself, this temptation, because I'm a pastor and, you know, you're teaching people. You have this, and people will tell me this, books and articles and speeches, the more you know about the world, the more fully you can inform people, you know, about teaching and stuff like that. I think, okay, so I should learn about all kinds of things. And so then I get to this cliff where there's something actually that's, as Paul described in Ephesians, futile, it's dark, it's all that stuff in the world. Should I go learn about that so I can help people? What do I do? I want to learn as much as I can so I can help the best I can, but that just seems dumb, you know? So maybe that's what he has in mind there, that just because it exists and just because you could learn about it, stay naive. And in fact, there's a good indicator about that because he tells Timothy, stay away from old wives' tales and fables and myths. Now, Timothy could have just justified it and said, look, people are interested in it. I need to learn about it so I can talk to them intelligently about it. I've heard that when it came to the Da Vinci Code. I've heard that when it comes to the Gospel of Thomas, you know. And the problem with that is there's always 10 of those popping up. So if I spend all my time exploring all the weird stuff so I can talk about it to people, when do I have time to look at the real thing, you know? So we have to be cautious, and I think that's where what you're talking about comes into this. Can I make the choice to remain naive about things that have no substance or value? I can make that choice, whether I'm a pastor or not. I don't have to go down every rabbit trail to learn everything about everything because I don't have time to do that. I've got to prioritize what I'm going to focus on and learn about. So I think there's a lot to that sense of innocence. Will I keep my mind fixated on what is good and useful and profitable rather than chase a bunch of rabbit holes or rabbit trails? What else? Any other distinctions you can think of between childish and mature thinking? Well, one came to mind to me recently. I was dealing with one of our kids specifically about something, and it struck me. And it wasn't a big deal, but it had to do with obedience, disobedience. So that's what was the big deal to me. And when I was talking to him, I was realizing, in the childish thinking, it's about the here and the now, this moment. I want it or I don't. You know, I'm hungry or I'm not. Whatever. It's this moment's pleasure. And you, as a child, you haven't really developed the capacity to project into the future, what will this mean for later? I don't know if you've seen those tests they've done where it's different foods, but it's marshmallows or it's candy or it's ice cream or something. They'll sit children down, and they've done this in actual clinical tests, psychological tests. They sit them down with a cookie on the plate, one cookie. And they say, now if you sit here for 15, I'm going to leave the room, and if you sit here and you don't eat that cookie for 15 minutes, when I come back in, I'll give you 3 cookies instead. Or you can eat the cookie while I'm gone. Either way, whatever you want to do. So they do these tests with boys and girls, different ages, and they're just trying to find out the cognitive skills of the benefit and all that stuff. And what they found out was most of the kids would eat the one cookie because it's in front of them. They know they could get more if they wait, but this is right in front of them, so they eat the one. There are some of the kids, and they tried to figure out what was different about them or what made them this way. Some of the kids were able to think to themselves, I'd rather have 3. I'll just let that go because 3 are coming, But for most kids, that's just one example of the evidence of that. For most kids, if it's right in front of me, that's what matters. That's what I'm thinking of. I think it's a very adult or mature way of thinking that I have to evaluate, if I make this choice right now, what's going to result later? What's coming down the road? And this is everything we're deciding. What I eat? Is that not the worst one ever? The cake is good, I want to eat it. Oh, I didn't think about the fact that, what is it, a moment on the lips, a lifetime on the hips or something? That's exactly right. Money, if I spend this money now and charge it to my credit card, this will be with me for years. But I really want it. Everything that we deal with is that mature thinking. This decision will have long-term ramifications. Also, what I watch, we talked about this before. I want to sit down and watch something, kind of flipping through my options. I've got nothing else to do, I'll just watch this. If that's a very childish way to view it, I'll just watch it because it looks interesting. The mature way to view it is, now if I watch this, what's that going to do to me? Or what better use could I have of my time or something? So there's so much behind the childish, mature thinking that I think Paul's trying to indicate. Now, in this particular context, what is he wanting them to be mature about? Think about the gifts that God have given you, the spiritual gifts God's given you, in a mature way. Not what you can get out of it for yourself, but what is the long-term best benefit to this whole church body? Why has God given me this gift? And what's the best way I can use it? I think, more so in my generation, you guys would have to speak of your generation rather than my doing so. But I see a lot of this struggle of childish thinking in my generation, of compulsive, impulsive, supermarkets, no? Well, you know what they put at the register. The impulse buy, we know. This is the psychology of humans. They use it to their advantage. They put the nicest cars on the street side at the dealership, and they even put it on a pedestal because they know us. Window shopping's a real thing. And that's why you put the nice things in the window. And that's why they pay people big bucks to make the window dressings so pretty because they know us, the impulse of things. So I think when it comes to our minds being reshaped to be like Jesus, 2 of the key things I think that we've talked about are key to that too. Am I focused on myself? That is not Jesus. In my decision, am I thinking beyond myself, the ramifications beyond myself in this one area that I'm thinking about? And number 2, am I thinking of the long-term implications of what I'm about to do or say? We haven't even talked about the words we use. Oh my gosh. Gossip, self, long term. If we would just have those 2 filters, we would be so mature in our thinking. If I gossip, what is the ramification beyond me, outside of me? Well, number 1, I'm damaging the person I'm talking to because I'm sucking them into my gossip vortex. It's evil. And the other thing is, whoever I'm talking about, I've damaged them too. Even if they don't know it. I've damaged their credibility, I've damaged this person's view of them or something. And I've dishonored my king by disobeying him. If I was looking at it that way, with that mature lens, gossip would be like, ew, no. Because it started in my heart and mind. I don't want that. Those three things, damaging this person, that person, and God, I don't want any of that. But the childish view is, this is really juicy and they're going to really want to hear this, and it's me. How about the long-term ramifications of gossip? What could this thing I'm about to say, outside of this moment, what could this lead toward if I really let this out? And one of the things a mature mind realizes is, I don't know. I have no idea the power that this has to do damage. I think I might know, but the childish mind says, so I probably do know. The mature mind says, even if I think I know, I don't. I don't know where this could lead, and I don't want to. I don't want this horse out of the barn, because who knows what damage it could do. So you see, that we could talk about a myriad examples of everything boiling down to this kind of maturity in our thinking. Am I focused on myself or others? Am I focused on right now or the long view? And as eternal beings, the long view is the only one that makes sense. Because if we're eternal beings fixated on this moment, we've kind of missed it. We're not really seeing reality the way it is. Let's reflect on Jesus for a second. He's our favorite, right? Can you think of any things in his life, decisions he made, that reflect those two elements of maturity? Thinking of others instead of self, and the long view instead of the moment.
First thing came into my mind was him saying, "Let the children come unto me."
Yeah, good. Explain, how was that touching on those two issues?
Well, weren't the disciples saying, shooing the children away?
Yeah.
Don't bother Jesus.
That's right.
He's saying, no, I want them.
Yeah. And I don't know this for sure, but I'm thinking of who Jesus was. And I think the long-term thing would have really hit because he knew that if they come and he blesses them, think about that. Messiah blessing your kid. Oh, if they come and he blesses them, and it'll take some time, and I think that's why that's such a good example. The disciples were fixated on this moment. Jesus is tired. He's been doing a lot. They're just kids. Leave him alone. Jesus had so in the instant that would have been gratifying because I really do need a break. But in the long view, if I bless these children, that blessing will be real. And as they go off and live their life, that blessing will go with them. Like, that's long term good. And then the selfless thing, of course, for Jesus is to say, okay, let's do it. I'll do some more for people. I'll empty myself out even more. Very good example. Any other examples? There's the big one in the garden. And he says, not my will, thy will be done. I mean, obviously thinking of others, Father and the sinners. And the long view being, I'm going to suffer horribly, and that's what he wanted to avoid, was this moment or the next coming moment's suffering. But in the long view, he knew what the Father promised, the salvation of the world and your glory, And so Jesus, in fact, I love this text. Let's look, you don't have to turn there, I'll read it for you, but if you want to, turn to Hebrews 12, because this statement has so seared itself into my spirit. It comes to mind so often when I think about Jesus. It's in Hebrews 12, verse 2. He tells us at the end of verse 1, so this is Hebrews 12, 1 and 2. At the end of verse 1, it says, let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. And this is the part. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. See, that statement tells me something. He had the choice to focus on this moment's suffering or the joy ahead of him. And for the joy ahead of him, he endured this moment's suffering and shame and all that. That's mature thinking. Like a lot of us, I think, would have just cut and run because we want to avoid this moment's unpleasantness and pain and horror. And Jesus said, no, there's something coming that is so much more valuable and important. So I'm going to undergo this moment's horror for that coming joy and glory. So I think that's a lot that we can think on when we hear what Paul says. When you stop thinking like children, stop living for now and stop living for me. Live for them and live for them. Hey, that's catchy. I should write that down. Live for them and live for them. Any other thoughts on that instruction about how to think as adults rather than children? All right. Do you find, this is just, I don't have a, it's not a right or wrong, but do you still struggle with those two areas? Some people may have matured to where that's just natural, but do you still struggle with those two issues of myself versus others, or right now versus later? Yeah, probably in some ways. Are there any areas where you feel like, actually, I think I've got the maturity down? It's not bragging. We're just grateful for what Christ has done with us, that you're able to see others and you're able to think in the future. Any examples of that recently? If you had a victory?
I think it becomes easier as you mature.
Yeah.
Because it's easier to see the needs of others because of experiences that you've had, and if you know that you can help someone to, I just think it becomes easier as you get older, if that's what you're leaning toward.
Yeah. I was just encouraging to hear people's success stories sometimes. That's why I'm asking if there's any examples. I found that being a parent helped me a lot with that. Because when I see it playing out in my kids, I saw it in myself. Like, oh. And I'm giving them all these profoundly wise things. I'm like, oh my gosh, I should do that. I should do what I'm saying, yeah. So, I mean, whether you're a parent or a teacher, but when you're trying to explain reality to someone smaller than you, you're hearing it from your own self. You're like, dang, that's true. Guess I should do that. I think that's one reason God gave me kids, was to show me who I am. Dang, I do that. Dang, I do that. Yeah. And then it's good for Christina and myself too, because when we see them interacting in certain ways, and they're like, oh man, I think we do that to each other sometimes too. Dang, we do that. It's so funny. Ah, God's smart. He knows what he's doing. Let's go to 2 Corinthians 10:3. Now this was brought up last week. And I want to, it's 10:3 through 6. The one statement that has to do with thoughts is kind of a bumper sticker statement that you can pull out of its context, and it sounds maybe a little different than it really was what Paul wrote. So I want to read the longer flow of thought here. Let's go back to verse 1. Would somebody read verses 1 through 6? It says 2 Corinthians 10, 1 through 6.
Now I, Paul, myself, am pleading with you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ, who in presence am lowly among you, but being absent and bold toward you. But I beg you that when I am present, that I may not be bold with that confidence by which I intend to be bold against some, who think of us as if we walked according to the flesh. For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in God, for pulling down strongholds, casting down arguments and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ, and being ready to punish all disobedience when your obedience is fulfilled.
Ooh. So in other words, he's got a personal relationship with these Corinthians. And as he mentions there, he's got a reputation for writing very forcefully. And we've seen some of that. Like, he just wrote to them in that last letter, stop thinking like children. You know, he gets kind of in there, in the face. And he says, but when I come around, then I seem meek and humble. Like, I can't do it to your face the way I can from far away with letters. So he said, well, I would rather not come and have to be fierce with you in presence. I'd rather come in the gentleness and humility of Jesus. And what he's pointing out is the way that they were viewing him was worldly. Because in the world's way, if you're a strong leader, you're a bully. And you use your leadership and strength to get things done, And there's that threatening. And Jesus said that the rulers of the Gentiles lorded over them. But not so with you, he said. And you remember he said, the greatest among you will be the one who serves. That's what he said. And then he said, the Son of Man didn't come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So Jesus comes along, just like with everything else, he turns leadership on its head compared to the world's way. The world's way is you come in with force and fierceness to get things done, and Jesus' way is you serve the ones that you lead, and you show them the way of the cross. So that's what Paul's really upset about. You're comparing me to worldly leaders thinking that I'm falling short. I'm not even trying to be like them, But this is what he says about his role and the other apostles' role in trying to combat worldly thoughts and worldly ways of thinking. He says, we don't wage war as the world does. Interesting, he uses war as his image here. And that's fierce stuff. That's important. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. Now, we have to assume he doesn't mean literal strongholds, because he is not militaristic, right? Jesus never sent out a military. So he's got to be speaking of spiritual strongholds, right? And now, spiritually speaking, what would those strongholds be? It'd be idolatry. It'd be the pagan philosophies. It would be the Jewish legalism and hypocrisy. It's all these strong defenses of the enemy that have people captive. It's holding people captive in the worldly way. He then says, we demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. So now this is where we know he's talking about things of the mind. They set themselves up against the knowledge of God. So really what he has in mind here is not my individual thoughts about, food and shopping and sex and those things. He's talking about on the social scene in the world where people live and eat and work every day. Those ways of thinking that are the obstacles to people being open to God. Those dams, we were talking about before, that hold back the mind washing that God wants to give us. What he's saying is, we are warring against that. We are trying to tear those down so people can be free. So this is a very spiritual thing he's talking about. And you can, his passion and his commitment is so clear in this passage. Because he speaks of it so forcefully, warring, tearing it down, demolishing it, right? And so it's with that in mind that he says, we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. So again, he's not just talking about that thought that went through my mind when I was praying, though I think it could apply to that. His main idea is the thoughts that stand against God, that try to get me to think that following Jesus or obeying what God says doesn't make sense, that there's this better way in the world that makes more sense to me, something. He says, we've got to take those thoughts captive. And taking captive is another war term, isn't it? That's when captives are taken, is in war. You've conquered them. They've got all these people around. Well, now they're our slaves. And particularly in the Roman Empire's way of doing it, because Paul uses the same language about himself as an apostle being captive. He said it feels like we're brought along like captives in the line after the enemy's triumphed. Because he felt like they were the scum of the earth, in the eyes of the world. They were the least and the nobodies. But here the thought is that the church, the gospel, the people who serve the gospel, they are marching forward in the spiritual conquest. And they are tearing down the enemy's kingdom. I love this vision. Because it reminds me of what Jesus said to the apostles. He said, Peter, I call you Peter, rock. And on this rock I will build my church. And the gates of Hades, death, will not prevail against it. And I grew up my whole life thinking, so the church won't be defeated. Like hell will attack the church, but the church will never be defeated. And then someone pointed out to me, I don't remember who it was or when, he said the gates of hell, or the gates of Hades, or the gates of death won't overcome the church. Gates are not offensive, they're defensive. So what that means is the gates of death are being attacked by the church. Oh, the church is on the offense. Hell or death is on the defense, because that's where the gates are, on the defense. So as the gospel through the church is coming to dismantle the work of death and Satan, what did Jesus promise? The gates won't withstand the attack of my church. Man, that changed the entire statement, because I had that defensive view of the church. The world's against us. They're coming after us. Retreat, retreat, and keep what we've got, that whole thing. And Jesus' vision is not that. His vision is what Paul had. We're at war, and we are the ones demolishing. We are the ones tearing down. We're the ones making advance because the gospel's on the move. So what can we say then about our own minds in relationship to what he said? What does it mean for us to demolish arguments and pretensions and take captive thoughts? I think what it means is we have to take very seriously what's happening in our minds. Like as seriously as we would take war. But not just our minds, the minds of our children, the minds of our neighbors and coworkers. Like we have to be aware that this is not a neutral process. There's always a force working towards the minds of ourselves and the people around us. There's always something working on the minds of people. And if Paul's language is right, there's two sides drawn up, like in a warfare, it's not only just two countries involved, but there's two sides usually. And this one's hard for me to talk about without pausing and seriously considering whether I take it seriously enough. Because you kind of get into churchy mode where you just do your thing. You do the Bible studies, you go to church, and everything will work out. And then I come to the scriptures and I read things like this where it's war, War is like all in. You're either all in or you're not. You're not in at all. And I have images of Britain during World War II, and they're getting bombed. And everybody, the entire nation had to be involved, because the whole nation was a target. In America, it's been different. We send those guys off, and they do our wonderful work, and we're so grateful for them. But we go on with life as usual. But that's why I think I have trouble when it comes to these texts. I'm like, Lord, I don't even know if I know how to do warfare. I've never been in that, to take something that seriously. And I was thinking, and I wasn't there, obviously, but I just learn about it and hear things about it. I mean, in Britain, the whole nation was called to stack up sandbags on the buildings, and they had to recycle things. Like, I think even here, didn't we do that with tires and everything? And like, all in, everybody. We're all got to be doing something to get this done. So to think of that, are we really in a war? And are we given this much power in this world? And I mean all of the church, not just those mighty men like Paul, but does the church possess this kind of power? And if so, first in me, but then in the lives of others, wow, I need to be really conscious, really aware of what's endangering and what the gospel can do to that, what the gospel can do to dismantle false thinking and stuff like that. So I don't know. That's a lot to take in too. We're looking at a lot of meaty passages. Probably can't take all of these in at this moment, but maybe pick one or two this week to just kind of mull it over. What do I do with that? Because that's real. Wow, this is reality. And I wanted to end our time by talking about that process of the mulling over. Because when we talked about practically how do we renew our minds, or how do we get our minds to change to be more and more like Jesus, looking at these kinds of passages, talking them through, we're actually participating in meditation together, which is my favorite kind of meditation, doing it together. discussion with other disciples is so powerful in meditation. But meditation is something we're meant to do alone and together. And I think meditation on the truth of the Scripture is our greatest process of the renewing of the mind. And we've talked about it before, but just talk more about it. Some of you probably know this better than I, but I learned at some point that the key to washing hands is not just having soap involved. Because, you grow up, wash your hands, you get soap, you do this, and your hands are clean. And then I, matured in my thinking, and I found out, I got new information that said the length of time you do it matters a lot. Huh. So if I squirt soap, do this, rinse it off, I'm not clean? Smells clean, come on. I got stuff to do. And there's actually, it was on a late night show. I never saw it, but I think it was posted on Facebook or something. There was some medical guy on this late show. And it's an entertainment show, so it's kind of weird that he was on there. But he was showing, I guess it was like a public service announcement segment. He was showing the difference between the squirt wash, like I just described, and then the soap, rinsing, and counting, I don't remember the time he said, 20 seconds, whatever it was, and really doing a thorough wash where you rub your hands under the water. And what they did was they showed a test of, it was like disease or germs or something. When you did the quick wash, there's almost no change from before you washed your hands to the number of germs and all that stuff. Then he demonstrated the proper thorough way to wash hands, and then he did the test, and you find out, oh my gosh, it decreased the bacteria or whatever tremendously. Same soap, same water, it was just duration, right, and thoroughness. And I was thinking a lot about that when it comes to the washing of our minds. Meditation is that. That's what meditation is. It's doing this over and over. You're basting is another way you could think of it. You're basting in that truth, and it's the length of time matters, And a lot of times what we do in Bible studies or church services, we get the quick wash. And okay, it's not quick, it's a half hour. But, like we're hearing it and then we move on, the quick wash. Meditation is, you just settle down, slow down, really thoroughly get in it. Get into those fingernails. One very indelicate way meditation has been described is the chewing of the cud. Because cows have like 4 stomachs or something. I used to think it was 7, and I was talking about it in a sermon one time, and there was a farmer guy in the back who said, there's 4 stomachs. Okay, I'm sorry. So anyways, there's some number of stomachs. I got misinformation somewhere. And so once the cow eats, it goes into one stomach, and then this is so gross, they bring it up and they chew on it some more. And it goes into the next stomach, and then it comes up, and they do it over and over again, which is like, whoa, gross. But that is the picture of meditation also. Because, like, for instance, we're talking about these verses today. Chew it up, okay, talk about it, go off. And maybe later today or tomorrow, the verse comes back, and just kind of, yeah. And then, you put it aside to do your stuff, and then the next day or the day after that, yeah. It's kind of like that cow. It's coming back up. Because that's the washing. The quick wash doesn't do it. And I think we all know that. We've experienced that enough. The quick wash doesn't quite do it. But if we can choose to come back to it and just thoroughly just keep water flowing, keep rubbing it into our minds and massage it into our minds and spirits. And one of the keys to meditation is asking questions. And that's why I do a lot of that. It's not to make people uncomfortable or put anyone on the spot. To me, without questions, meditation is impossible. I don't even know what to do when I'm meditating if not asking. I'm trying to look at this issue, whatever I just looked at in the Scriptures, from every possible angle. Where does that fit in the world? Where does that fit in life? What was Paul talking about? Why did he use that word? And as I do that, I may not understand it all perfectly, but I'm getting somewhere. I'm starting to scratch away at this thing. And suddenly you find out, oh, there it is. Like, for instance, we read, in your thinking, be adults. Don't be children, but be adults. And that's why I have to ask the question, well, what does that even mean? What's the difference? What marks childish versus adult thinking? And if I never ask that question, I have no idea where to go with that statement. I'm just repeat the statement over and over to myself? No, I need to I need to poke it and prod it and kick it and open up the hood and look inside. So whether you're used to doing that, whether that's something you've already become familiar with, start, at whatever level you can or know how to do. And just start chewing on the cud. Start just kind of simmering in the juices about whatever text really you think needs focus, whatever reality you think was really important. And like I say, I think one of the best things to do is share it with somebody. Share your meditation, share your questions. Whether it could be your kids, it could be your spouse, it could be anybody. And not only are you benefiting, but you're blessing them too. You're bringing them into something really good. So, in terms of practical ways to reshape your thinking, that I think is one of the best pieces of counsel I could give. Practice and develop the act of meditation. Eastern meditation is very different than Christian meditation. Because in Eastern meditation, you get your body postured to where it's very relaxed and centered, even with your finger, like that. And you're supposed to make a sound like Om. And the goal is to empty yourself. That really is the goal of Eastern meditation, is to become empty, is to become blank, because you're waiting for an imprint or something. I don't know. I'm not an expert in that stuff. That's one of those, should I go in to find out about all that stuff or stay naive? But anyway, you're supposed to empty yourself. This is the exact opposite in Christian meditation. You're not emptying yourself at all. You're purposefully filling yourself with something from the Word. You're not trying to lose something, you're trying to bring something up at the forefront. And so there's a lot of ways to do it, but that's always the goal. You don't have to sit in a certain posture. You can even be talking while you do it. The goal is keep it here at the very forefront and poke and prod and all those things. So meditate. Hopefully the word meditation doesn't weird you out. I don't mean that Om meditation. I mean working through a truth and keeping it at the forefront of your mind. So, any last thoughts or reflections on the things we looked at today?